Welcome, everyone, to the Campaign for Social Science annual lecture. I'm Bobby Duffy. I'm chair of the Campaign for Social Science, and it is a real huge pleasure for me to be hosting our annual lecture again this year from our new president of the Academy of Social Sciences, Will Hutton. Will's lecture couldn't be on a more timely and important subject, or be more aligned to the key themes of the campaign's mission, which is to show how social science can advance our understanding of the contemporary world and help us find ways to shape a better future. The lecture is called "Its Institutions Stupid? The Moralisation of Capital," and has a focus on the structures and institutions that support our economy, as well as Will's keen focus on fairness within our economic system. So this very much follows on from the campaign's recent work exploring the levelling up agenda driven by Will, which includes the hub, a new hub on our hugely improved website, which features comment pieces from really key social scientists and practitioners, looking at the various aspects of the agenda. It also has included an online TEDx style event, which we ran last month, which is also available on the website, and the Place to Be report, which we published with Sage Publishing. For those of you who may not know, the Campaign for Social Science is part of the Academy of Social Sciences and was formed as a key initiative with just one objective, one big objective, to promote the vital role of social science in improving decision-making, society, and lives. And it relies entirely on the support of a host of individuals and groups who are working in the sector, including our Academy Fellows, a number of universities and learned societies that support us, Sage Publishing, of course, is our lead commercial sponsor, an excellent board drawn from across the sector, and small but very dedicated staff, including our excellent chief exec, Rita Gardner. Recently, adding to this mix, Will has arrived as the new president of the Academy and has brought, as you can imagine, his own fantastic energy, enthusiasm, and ideas. The TEDx event was an excellent showcase of bringing together academics, practitioners, and policymakers to look at the real practicalities of dealing with regional and other inequalities, and offering practical advice on what we could do to help that policy succeed. Very positive agenda. The lecture this afternoon, I'm sure, will show that same sort of energy from Will and the ideas that he brings. After Will, we're really delighted to have a response from Baroness Manoush Shafiq, who I'll introduce properly after Will's lecture. Then we will have around half an hour to take questions from the audience. Do get in early, though, using the Q&A function. We've had 1,700 sign-ups for today's event, which just shows you the level of interest in the subject matter and hearing from our panel. And we'll do our best. I'll do my best to get through as many as possible, but getting in early is always a good thing. And do tweet as we go through. It's hashtag campaign lecture 21. But before Will, I wanted to introduce Katie Metzler, who is Vice President at Sage Publishing. Sage, who have sponsored our annual lecture for a number of years now, which we're incredibly grateful for. And Katie is an incredibly valuable member of our campaign board. So over to you, Katie.
Thank you, Bobby, and welcome everyone to Sage and the campaign's annual lecture. Our mission at Sage Publishing is to build bridges to knowledge, and one of the ways that we aim to do that is through events like this one, which are free and open to everyone, and which focus on the role of the social sciences in helping us to understand and tackle the biggest issues facing society. And I think holding an annual lecture provides an opportunity to reflect on the year that's passed and also to think about the year ahead. In 2020, our lecture was on how social science can help us survive the post-truth pandemic, fitting for a year where COVID and misinformation were themes that dominated our lives. And certainly they remain dominant themes this year, with the recent news about Omicron making it very clear that this pandemic is far from over. So while the term recovery feels premature as we look ahead to 2022, we do have to make space again for conversations about what it will take to create a better, fairer society now and in a post-pandemic future. With that in mind, Sage and the campaign recently hosted an online event on levelling up, which Bobby mentioned, and we published a report on levelling up called The Place to Be. I think both the event and the report show how much social science has to offer in terms of understanding what works in reducing inequality in places and among people, but also just how hard it is to do, because it requires addressing so many things at once, from education to housing to infrastructure to the short-termism of governments. And so I'm really pleased that tonight's lecture is on institutions, the need for contemporary capitalism to be reset, and the contributions that social science has made in generating the theory and evidence that could underpin this transformation. Because I think it's clear that if we want a better, fairer society in the future, what got us here won't get us there. This lecture also comes at an important moment for the institution that is SAGE as we look ahead to our future. So SAGE was founded by Sarah Miller McCune and George McCune in 1965. And early in the company's history, Sarah and George decided that SAGE should never be bought by another publisher and lose its ability to focus on its mission or its identity, rather than focusing on shareholders or investors' financial goals. And as of just this week, Sarah has taken the step of transferring her voting shares and thus control of the company to the SAGE Sarah Miller McCune Trust as part of an estate plan, which will ultimately see a group of universities becoming SAGE's beneficial owners. And this plan guarantees the independence of the company and ensures that SAGE is free to focus on our mission to build bridges to knowledge through education and research publishing, and through sponsorship of the Campaign for the Social Sciences and events like this one, which celebrate the contributions of the social sciences. So thank you all very much for joining us tonight. And with that, I'll pass back to Bobby to introduce our speaker.
Thank you so much, Katie. So we all want to get on swiftly to lecture from Will, so I won't give a long introduction to his incredible career. Will is a political economist, author and columnist for The Observer, for which he was he's a former editor. He was the principal of Hertford College at University of Oxford from 2011 to 2020. He's founded a number of think tanks and other organizations, including the Purposeful Company, and just recently the Fairness Foundation that he's involved with. And is the author of several best-selling books on political economy, maybe most notably The State We're In, which is genuinely one of my favorite books on economics when I was studying it. So over to you, Will.
Great. Well, thank you, Bobby. Thank you, Manoush, for commenting on this. And it's been, and thank you, SAGE, and thank you, the campaign. And thank you all, so many of you have actually signed on. It's been quite a thing, this. I've been thinking, it's brought to this lecture and thinking about what to say this evening. It's kind of, I've been deliberating on it for some days now. And it's kind of, it's been a great opportunity for me to kind of think through precisely what I think and draw all the strands together of my writing over the years. And here's the heart of the matter. We live in capitalist societies that have created stunning wealth, living standards doubling every generation, bewildering innovation, accelerating introduction of the great general purpose technologies that transform our lives. 4 in the 19th century, 8 in the 20th, phenomena like electricity, the computer, and undoubtedly that will double again in the 21st century. Just think how the mobile internet have transformed our lives, and how Elon Musk is so dramatically lowering the cost of space flight that I think that space and all that's going to happen in space in the next generation is going to provide another general purpose technology. And we understand capitalism as this restless, unceasing, dynamic process. 2/3 of the companies in the FTSE 350 were not there 25 years ago. And companies appear while others decline. And it creates, but it destroys. Creative destruction, in the great words of Schumpeter. But as the Chinese would say, there are 7 criticisms leveled against capitalism. It may create value, but it extracts it as well. It is careless of natural capital. And after COP26, I don't need to say much about that, but actually capitalism still does treat nature as a free good. Whether it's polluting the air, sea, cutting down forests, overfishing, overhunting. It is careless too of another capital, people capital, employees who aren't paid what they should be paid on employment contracts which shrivel their humanity. And it's careless also of innovative capital. There's too much monopoly, too much economic concentration. There's no inbuilt check to super profits. And this phenomena of Raunchier capitalism, where companies don't so much innovate and create value, but kind of own the franchise to such an extent that they're not charging profit for it, they're charging a rent for it. That could be a digital platform, that could be a payment service, but Raunchier capitalism has always been there, but it's got more intense with the arrival of digitalization. And closing down openness and creating monopoly is a third big criticism. Careless of social capital. I mean, capitalism creates violent inequality, low wages, high-risk jobs alongside paychecks that allow recipients to establish dynasties far beyond what anyone would consider proportional to their economic contribution. And all of that creates unearned good luck and unearned bad luck. And capitalism does not self-correct those tendencies. Rather, it sets up self-reinforcing forces that amplify advantage and disadvantage. Capitalism over-prioritizes financial capital, the fifth of the five criticisms. It underinvests, and you have the systematically. The sixth criticism, it imposes shocks, not just the rhythm of the business cycle, but actually crashes and booms. And everyone who's lived through the financial crash of 2008-9 knows what I'm talking about. And lastly, it undervalues the public realm, the common weal, whether it be the public infrastructure, a public park, and they don't happen spontaneously from the operation of capitalism. They have to be supported and created to provide universality of access and equal access. So any structure, any theory, structure and policy, which has to promote our well-being in the most profound sense, has to want to capture the best parts of capitalism, but actually dispose with those seven criticisms. Well, enter economics, which tries to get to the bottom of what's going on. And I think as a lifelong kind of preoccupation of mine, I am a political economist, I think there are broadly three essential frameworks with which to look at capitalism and try and tease out the answer to this dilemma. And they're underpinned by a moral view of what constitutes human nature and what constitutes the good society. And it's that moral, hold in mind while I'm talking, this kind of morality which underpins these perspectives. And the economists hold this view of human nature with quiet but messianic zeal. Whenever you hear an economist saying, I'm just an economist, never believe that faux modesty. These are some of the most passionate and opinionated intellectuals around, and why the subject's so engrossing. So, framework one, and I'm calling this not neoclassical economics or free market economics, but I'm calling it the economics of I, the primacy of individualism and liberty. So I think that's the morality that underpins the economic that spills from it. And essentially this school would say, forget about those seven criticisms. Capitalism is our creature, delivering what we want, responding to our demands. And to deliver those goods, if it's undervaluing those things, it's because we undervalue them. Capitalism will deliver the goods if only left to its own proclivities. It's essentially self-organizing, self-propelling, and self-dynamic. Don't worry about those shocks. We really have to put up with them rather than do the weather. And actually they sort themselves out. And the cost of intervening outweighs the benefits. Inequality, well, that's the price paid for capitalism's effectiveness. Wealth will trickle down. And why do this school have such confidence? Human beings are at bottom self-interested and greedy. But capitalism harnesses that to deliver the great good of economic dynamism and markets that work. Adam Smith's great dictum, it's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their self-interest. And they can go further. Forget instincts like love. Essentially, we fall in love with people from our own class and we calculate our advantage. Marriage is a market like any others, a transactional contract like any others. Women eye men and men eye women for what their economic benefit they're going to get from the marriage. Altruism only to make us feel good, not because we are intrinsically altruistic. And at the extreme, as the libertarian Ayn Rand argues in her novels, the only truly moral behavior is to be true to your own self and your own untrammeled ambitions. And as Adam Smith demonstrated, all of this will produce optimal outcomes for us all. It allows for specialization by producers and consumers to express their deepest wants and desires, some of which you may not like, but better their expression than suppression. The state's only role is to clear away any obstacles that may have occurred to obstruct that inherent capacity to self-organize. And very few monopolies anyway last for very long. At some of the extreme of this, but market themselves will pull them down. There'll always be that process of creative destruction. And as for the state, well, beware the state, because it's populated by self-interest individuals as well. And they aggrandize, they empire build. You've got to watch the state because it's not actually benevolent and are coercive. Liberty is the precondition, and if things go wrong, it's nearly always because the markets were inhibited by a regulator or some such. So it should be clear as I spell this out that the ideology is there for all to see, but it's the core of the standard economic model that rational economic agents respond to price signals with mathematical predictability. So there are truths in all of that. No one can deny those truths, but there are some wild omissions. What about those 7 criticisms? Does it solve the problem of value extraction? Does it solve the problem of climate? Can price signals really relay to us in 2021 the prospect of what may happen in 2050 if we don't kind of drive to net zero? Take a great entrepreneur like Elon Musk. He may be propelling there may be 100,000 satellites in space by 2029, but half of them will be owned by Elon Musk, a natural monopoly emerging one of the great potential areas that could benefit humankind. Are we good enough at knowing what our self-interest is? Aren't we more than self-interest? I mean, human beings are surely more complicated than just pursuing their self-interest. What about love, a demand for fairness, a genuine altruism, a desire to promote societal benefit? Aren't these emotions we have? Can we really be so confident that these economic bads, monopolies, will simply wither away? And can we imagine that the public realm can be wished into being at a flick of a switch to kind of make up for those shortcomings, which we know the market won't produce itself? And lastly, there's what we owe each other. Do we really believe that rugged individualism is the sole value system that makes us happy? So there you go, a framework and its criticisms. The second framework I'm going to call the economics of we, as opposed to the economics of I. And that is the primacy of group and equality. It takes the starting point, but believe it takes the starting point that those 7 criticisms are on the button, on the nail. They can't be wished away by the economics of I. And what's crucial to us as social beings is the group, society, the commonweal, and belonging to this as equals. And we know enough about human evolution to know that the creation of language, which enables us to act together in a group, was fundamental in human survival, to hunt, to farm, to see our predators. And that primeval urge to associate in a group is what underpins happiness and well-being. What people want is less the exercise of choice in markets, but rather to control their lives in the service of what they value. And that's best done socially, collectively, and as far as possible, equally. So while the I first, me first economists believe that the best form of health provision is individual insurance in markets, really we know that because bad health can hit anyone through no fault of their own, undeserved, unearned, brute bad luck, it's much better to opt for collective insurance, hence the NHS. We insure against brute bad luck collectively. And of course, large parts of contemporary capitalism collapsed into Raunchierdom. What do you expect? In this new world of digital kind of capitalism, Eric Schmidt, the former chair of Google, admitted that it had a kill in the crib strategy, a kill the baby in the crib strategy. Google would take over and take out young infant companies before they grew into competitors, and it would use its high stock market valuation to do just that in a kind of self-reinforcing circle, which permitted it to achieve great market dominance, a feature even more of digital capitalism than the capitalism that preceded it. Thus, access capitalism. Of course, we expect these Raunchiers to want access to ministers to get juicy contracts to manage COVID. So of course, you expect nothing less. That's exactly what one can expect. And as Thomas Piketty demonstrated, if the return on capital is greater than the long run growth rate, capital has an immutable capacity to become ever more concentrated. And that means that the owners of capital morph into a caste. Society becomes less open, and only wars and slumps interrupt the process. Essentially, the economists, the kind of we school, argue that capitalism is a jungle, needs to be democratized and closely regulated where it's not even socialized. Again, as I'm speaking, I'm sure you can hear truth in all of that, and some of you may be nodding your head, saying, yep, but I must remind you, capitalism does create and does innovate. And it's in its own interest to celebrate other values than profit. It's in its interest to respect community, look after workforces. It's not stupid what the kind of economists of I say, that actually, if we want it, capitalism will deliver. It's not demonic, although sometimes parts of it has that characteristic. So at the moment, there are some capitalists taking climate change profoundly seriously. Nobody is all seeing. We all know the danger of groupthink. The great advantage of having many runners and riders in a plural capitalist economy is society doesn't have to bet on one option. It allows different solutions, different ideas, different business models to emerge. And groups are oppressive and very often coercive. Workforces, they accept their hard work should be rewarded. And they know that people can game the group. They don't like shirkers. And individuals, don't they have rights? And lastly, don't deify the notion of the public. We have to be very careful about how we design the governance, the checks, balances, rule of law, because otherwise it can become as dangerous as the I economists argue. So there we are, these two rival schools, which define the debate between left and right. What I'm going to argue in this lecture is that there, of course, there are truths in both these frameworks, but not enough. And of course, in practice, they make concessions to each other, but they still kind of hold close to themselves the utopian citadel, which is the core of their thought. And here's my contention, is we should think in terms not of a having a kind of utopia that we know may be unrealizable, but we hold it close to our heart. Let's talk about realizable kind of utopias. And let's not concede bits to each other, but let's try and fuse these two frameworks. And in the process, give capitalism a moral foundation in which you both kind of give a foundation which permits kind of liberty and the I, but also acknowledges the importance of the we. And in the process, come up with something better. And as I was figuring out this talk, I was realizing I was really building on the shoulder of giants. And actually, where economics and where I think the wider social sciences are going. And my influences are Joseph Schumpeter and his current disciple, Philippe Aghion, on the creativity of capitalism, while being aware of its socially destructive downsides, big tick. Another huge influence on me is Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, and his great interpreter, the Norwegian Axel Leyenhofer, who I believe should have won the Nobel Prize for economics for really kind of drilling into what Keynesianism was about and demonstrating that not that it was a particular kind of description of capitalism, but a description of all capitalisms at all times, because there is differential speed of adjustment in the different markets that constitute a capitalist economy. The labor market, the financial markets, lumpy capital investment markets simply clear at differential rates and are beset by existential uncertainty. And consequently, you can expect the market economy to be all over the place in disequilibrium most, if not all the time. Karl Polanyi, I love his book, The Great Transformation. Uninhibited free markets, laissez-faire economics, pulled down the 19th century civilization and its social structures by actually transactionalizing and commoditizing everything, and gave birth to fascism and communism. But notwithstanding his condemnations of capitalism, I'm impressed by Hannah Arendt's insights on the essence of the human condition, and she is someone who actually, in her writing, in her great book, The Human Condition, she tries to capture the sense, this complexity of who we are as human beings. Of course, we're individuals who want to act on the world. Of course we are that. But we also know in the acting on the world, it will produce uncertain consequences, social consequences, which will need public handling. We need public organization, therefore, and it sits side by side with private action. And as she famously says, you need to understand the pleasures of a private garden, experience the publicness of a public park. But equally, to understand the pleasures of a public park, understand the privations of a private garden, you need to experience both the kind of householdness, the I-ness of a private garden and the we-ness of a public park are both parts of what we as human beings require. And lastly, Danny Roderick, great Harvard economist, he argues that successful capitalism requires institutions, the subject of this lecture. And he focuses on private property, the rule of law, the capacity to enforce contracts, entry into markets and competition, and the social contract that Manoush is going to talk about. But he's right. But here's the big point of what I'm trying to say tonight. We've got to go much further. We need to build institutions across the capitalist economy that covenant, I drive that point home, that verb home, that covenant through their constitutions, that they will respect values that we hold dear in the context of we-ness, equality, fairness, universality, transparency, and sustainability. And indeed, before the 21st century challenges of AI and the drive to net zero, I would regard getting these institutions right and being bigger in our thinking than even Danny Roderick argues, is more important than ever, and it can't be relied to emerge spontaneously in markets. When I'm talking institutions, we've got to be, I'm talking about the containing of this we morality, and with it, their purpose, which is fundamental to their core. And that means you've got to be really careful about the constitution of the institution. Now, I mean, university is a great British success story. They have constitutional autonomy and their academic freedom are underwritten. And if you think about the great institutions we have in the country, the BBC, the Bank of England, we've taken care about their kind of constitution. Other countries, especially those in Scandinavia and Germany, also take institutional design very seriously. But Anglo-Saxon economics, dominated by the primacy of I, has been too careless. Firms and banks are just economic agents, puppets of supply and demand. We don't have to think about the constitution of structure. So to create a fusion of framework 1 and framework 2, we need institutions that embody that and carry this moral DNA. And conceptually, if you like, the market will incorporate I-ness, and these plural institutions whose constitution we're going to be carefully designing hold the we. And that's how we create this fusion. So let me just run through, as I round off, what I mean by this. Firms are the core building block of the capitalist economy. If we're going to give them limited liability with all the privileges that confers, where they're public or private, they must write their social purpose and their societal obligation into their constitutions when they incorporate. They need to declare their purpose. This used to be a requirement of UK and US company law, and they should be consistently audited and held to account for delivering not just to shareholders, but all their stakeholders whose shareholders are one. And stakeholders should be afforded, if not positions on boards, at the very least fora in which there is regular consultation and information sharing. We cannot allow so much activity in our economy to be undertaken by private equity or special purpose vehicles or anonymized organizations who don't permit us to know who they are, what their purpose is, or to hold them account for delivering it. So this is a universal injunction. For firms whose social purpose is publicly determined and they're regulated because of their systemic importance, I'm thinking of utilities, banks, media companies, digital platforms, they should incorporate as companies which overtly set out to deliver public benefit. Again, incorporated in their constitution with higher levels of disclosure set by whatever the regulatory authority is about how they're going to deliver that public benefit. And they'll become a new class, an asset class, public benefit companies. And they will pursue high standards. They won't pollute rivers. There won't be 10-day power cuts after a storm. And they will be truthful and lawful in how they disseminate information if it's a digital platform. Then we need to just encourage a plurality of firms, especially firms that systematically share profits with their employees, mutuals and cooperatives, or whose founders turn ownership over to their staff, or in Sage's case, we learned tonight, to a panel of universities in the future. Again, the constitution of these firms needs to be carefully written, but congratulations to Sarah Miller-McCune, who yesterday has done just this, and actually is carefully writing the constitution of Sage so that it will permit it to serve the cause of maximizing the dissemination of academic knowledge, because it'll be universities who hold the majority of the votes on the new trust. But if we're going to do this, we've got to have firms that have a capital provided to them. And the providers of capital, the asset managers, the investment managers, the £7 trillion industry in Britain and much bigger worldwide, that needs to be constitutionally purposed as well. And they are going to have to simultaneously see the firms in whom they invest perform, but across all those 5 capitals that I mentioned at the outset of this lecture, not just financial capital, but natural capital, human capital, societal capital, innovative capital. We can already see this beginning to happen. I mean, there's $3 trillion invested in what are called environmental, societal, and good governance funds, ESG, and it's a step in the right direction. But we don't have clear metrics. It's not clearly understood by. There's not a commonality of understanding about what ESG means. There's a lot of ESG washing going on. We need, again, the constitution of the ESG fund and the way it's regulated has to be carefully thought through. And I would go beyond that also. We're far too careless about the quote, who gets listed on public markets and how shareholder votes are exercised, proxy votes by proxy agencies. We've got to have much more vigilance about the constitution of our capital markets and the constitution of the way votes are exercised in our companies, and more vigilance that the financial assets traded so furiously on these public markets are really assets that deliver socially useful outcomes, which they certainly weren't in the run to 2008-9. 21st century growth is about the fast dissemination and application of intellectual property. As I said earlier, at the moment, too many monopoly positions, think digital platforms, are protected by excessive protection of intellectual property. The intellectual property regime, which is going to be the core of the 21st century economy, needs to be biased to openness and open innovation, trading the intellectual property that you've uncovered rather than hoarding it. There has to be an open innovation revolution. And we have to help that along with the kind of intellectual property regime that we put into place. We need our universities to be more prepared to be more open source than they currently are about the intellectual property that their scientists and social scientists generate. The design of our banks, they will be purposed, and our investment institutions will be purposed in this kind of institutional revolution I'm proposing. But we'll need to go further. We will need to think of the constitution of public banks and public investment companies that will support what's happening. I noticed very interestingly that Sir Patrick Vallance and Lord Brown, who were co-chairs of the Science to Technology Committee, wrote to the Prime Minister and the Chancellor just recently, very interestingly, proposed, this was 3 months ago, proposing that Britain should establish a sovereign scale-up fund because of the shortage of money that they thought was being invested. There were too few people in the City of London and too few investment managers who knew enough about science to put money behind startups and kind of really good scientific ideas. And that they, to plug this gap, they proposed a sovereign scale-up fund. Correct, but its constitution, again, has to be very carefully thought through. A balanced board, independent of party affiliation. So these institutions have to be built to last, to survive changes of government, and has to be able to invest and lend on objective criteria and operate at scale. I'm on the board of the satellite applications Catapult, one of nearly a dozen of these kind of very small organizations, which were created in 2010 by the coalition government to promote technology transfer. And they are in a sense, the we and the I combined in their constitution. Our job is to promote kind of a vibrant, in my case, in the case of the satellite applications Catapult space sector, others a vaccines sector, in others smart cities, in others offshore drilling, in others smart manufacturing. But they're not well understood by either the private sector that comes to beats a path to a door, or by the British state, which provides us the crucial grants on which we pivot and depend. Are we public bodies? Are we private bodies? What we're trying to do is kind of acting autonomously like a university embedded in our constitution, promote the public good of vibrant, dynamic sectors in the economy of the future. But again, this fusion is so poorly understood in Britain that we constantly undernourished and constantly kind of under assault, really. And I think we really have to scale the catapults up and understand what they represent is a kind of institutional down payment on the kinds of things we need more widely. And institutions to promote and advance human capital. Here, my firm that should incorporate around a declared purpose, saying what it's on earth to do, should, as a basic presumption, assume that all its employees are members of the organization rather than disposable commodities, with skills and aptitudes that must be developed and promoted. Now, of course, there'll be derogations from that standard, but that should be the standard. And gig working and zero-hour contracts really exceptional. We need to think about the constitution of our unions. I want to legitimize employee voice. And we need to think carefully about how we can construct a kind of new wave of unions that are represent employees, share in profits, are co-decision makers, drive organizations forward. And again, they represent the we, and they need to be understood as a core part of actually the constitution of the organization. Institutions to promote training. And I hear a lot to say. I'm running out of time, and I can come back to in the Q&A section. But what I really think about this when I was researching this was the astonishing news that actually, whether it be educational funding in real terms, in 2024, we're back to where it was in 2010, after 14 years. And funding for FE colleges will still running on a per capita basis around a fifth of what it was in 2010. It's an astonishing dereliction of our human capital. We need institutions that support the early years. The first, Bobby very kindly mentioned my involvement with the Fairness Foundation. One of our priorities is, the brute bad luck of coming out of the kind of disadvantaged couples' loins in a disadvantaged part of the country can set you back completely unfairly for nothing you ever deserved. And actually, we really do have to have really scale up and invest in early years and the institutions like Sure Start that try to get it off the ground. We all know about the green emergency. I have a set of proposals about a network of green institutions that would deal with everything from waste through carbon capture through finance. But again, we need to create them, constitutionally entrench them, and they have to have in their DNA that those values of transparency, fairness, universality that I talked about at the beginning. A social contract to design out brute bad luck. Fundamental component of this. I'm going to let Manoush speak to that when she responds. But what I do want to say is that we want to have, the NHS is much loved. We need to think through how we can create institutions that populate our social contract that are as loved as the NHS. It would be fabulous, for example, if care homes were as loved or secondary schools as loved as the NHS. And it's not the provenance of this lecture, but as I conclude, I'm keenly aware that I've talked about design and the constitution of the institutions in the private sector, or where public meets private. But I'm as persuaded we're to think just as carefully about institutions of government, the executive, our democracy, our judicial system, as we do of these private sector institutions. And of course, the same goes for how we do how we organize tax, fiscal and monetary policy. There's not time, it goes without saying that that is part of my story. And I think that one of our carelessnesses in Britain about constitutions of institutions and of the importance of institutional structures to the dynamic of our capitalism and the firmness with which we hold a social contract so that we can trust it over time is because we've never thought carefully enough as a country about our constitution, which has just emerged out of battle between Parliament and Crown in the 17th century and the uneasy compromise of the glorious revolution of 1689. And there it's stuck. And as we're seeing under Boris Johnson, it is perfectly possible to regress. But to conclude, I don't think freebooting capitalists, the high priests of private equity or the denizens, the wilder fringe of the capital markets will much like what I've been saying, nor the libertarian right, but nor will some of the real socialists red in tooth and claw on the executive committees of some of our larger unions and in some of all around the place, actually, in some of our universities too, and wider political left. But here's my appeal to you, and I hope I've been persuasive enough. I think that what I've outlined can be done. In a sense, what I'm arguing for is economic, political, and social citizenship. And I think it would be popular. I think it would help to fix what's clearly a broken Brexit and this institutional structure, which is so much kind of in line with, it won't be the same institutions as they have in members of the EU, but first cousin to them, because all countries are path dependent. It'll be a bridge to a close relationship with the EU. And although this is about the economy, I do see what I'm proposing as a source of social and psychological well-being. Economic and social structures, we social scientists, it's the heart of what we propose. They work as a system. What I've tried to argue tonight is if we think of the institutions that populate our economic and social structures, we've got the best chance of wedding the economics of I and the economics of we, and actually giving our capitalism a moral foundation. And that's me done. Thank you very much.
Wow, that was brilliant. Thank you so much, Will. That was incredibly rich, covered so much ground in that time, and sets us up just excellently for the next steps of the evening, which is to hear a response from Baroness Manoush Shafiq. And Manoush is a leading economist and was appointed director of the London School of Economics and Political Science in September 2017. And there's so many highlights from her truly incredible career, including being the youngest ever vice president of the World Bank, serving as permanent secretary at the Department for International Development, deputy managing director of the IMF, deputy governor of the Bank of England. And in July 2020, Manoush was made a crossbench peer at the House of Lords. Manoush is also the author of What We Owe Each Other, a New Social Contract, which I'm reading right now and hugely enjoying, and perfect fit for this type of discussion on a connection between generations, taking a longer view of economic fairness. So the floor is yours, Manoush. A lot to respond to there. Oh, you're on mute, Manoush.
Thank you very much. And yes, and Will certainly covered lots of ground. So I'm going to focus in on a few areas to try and reflect on those very interesting remarks. I'm going to make 4 points. 1 on the nature of capitalism and economics, 2 on the importance of institutions, 3 on why we need a new social contract, and then finally something about the purpose of companies and the constitutional issues around corporations. So let me start with the nature of capitalism and economics. I don't think Will is talking about throwing away capitalism, and I'm rather relieved to hear that, because I think I do lots of events in which people say, we need to get rid of capitalism and we need to get rid of economic growth. And that's the only way we're going to save the planet and society. And, capitalism is a bit like what Churchill said about democracy, the worst possible system, but better than all the alternatives. Every other attempt at other economic models has failed. But I think the point I would make is that there are many, many flavors of capitalism. And capitalism in the United States looks very different than capitalism in Denmark or Germany, which looks very different than capitalism in Tanzania. And on growth, I think I don't believe that we need to lead hair shirt existences to save the planet. I think growth can look very different, and it goes to what incentives we create for all the actors in the economy that determines what kind of growth we get. And I would say that, I have to kind of defend my discipline of economics a bit, in that there is a sort of tendency to kind of put up a straw man of this is what economics thinks, which is the neoclassical, liberal, free market, et cetera, story. When in fact, if you talk to most economists, most of the really interesting stuff in economics over the last few decades has been about market failures and looking in much more interesting ways about using data sciences and empirically based economics and randomized controlled trials. And it's become a very different field than the straw man that we often talk about. And so I would and I think it's also interesting to note how many very mainstream economists are asking the sorts of questions that we're discussing today. And I could rattle off half a dozen who are in that space. So it is a very interesting time to be thinking about the nature of capitalism and the nature of economics. My second point is on institutions. And I guess I couldn't agree more that institutions are what it's about. I think the work of people like Asimoglu and Robinson and many others show very clearly that if you look at through economic history, what determines whether a country is rich or poor is the quality of its institutions. That they are the most important factors in determining the success of different countries. But I would also argue that markets are institutions, and the way we design markets is critical for determining the outcomes. One of the things I did when I was at the Bank of England is I led something called the Fair and Effective Markets Review in the wake of all of the terrible misconduct cases that we saw in the wake of the financial crisis, foreign exchange market manipulation, LIBOR manipulation, etc. And all of those had developed because we had allowed markets to grow in a way that was completely antithetical to true competition and serving the needs of customers. And what we tried to do in the review is to redesign the institutions that govern those markets, making some things criminal, requiring transparency of information vis-a-vis customers, and so on. So markets are institutions, and the way they are designed determines the kind of capitalism that we get. The way institutions are designed are also critical for determining the social outcomes. It is no accident that countries that have the best social outcomes, whether you look at life expectancy, health outcomes, et cetera, depends crucially on the quality of the institutions and the degree of accountability to which governments are held to. Countries that have very low levels of accountability, no free press, no independent parliaments, no independent judiciary, tend to have really poor social outcomes because governments can basically become rentiers and share the spoils among themselves and their friends and family. Whereas countries that have really strong institutions tend to deliver better social outcomes. And so for me, I would spend more time thinking about the design of market institutions and the design of the institutions that hold governments to account for delivering on what citizens want. I also think that, in the whole debate about globalization, it is true that capitalism and globalization subject countries to more economic shocks. If you have a closed economy, if you look at what happened to India in the 2008 financial crisis, not a lot happened to India in the 2008 financial crisis because it wasn't open to international capital markets. And so they weren't subjected to those shocks. On the other hand, India didn't grow a whole lot in that time either. And I think it's no accident that countries that are more open and subjected to shocks have bigger cushions, have bigger welfare states. If you look at the small open economies in Europe, for example, they're very open to global trade. They are subject to shocks, but those shocks don't cause massive social upheavals because people are looked after and cushioned and supported through those transitions. I would argue that a country like the United States, part of the reason we've had a backlash against an open trading system and a rise in protectionism and nationalism in the US is because the US has failed to provide cushions for its citizens to cope with the shocks that come with capitalism and globalization. My third point is around a new social contract and why I think we need one. I think it's what Will calls the moral foundations of capitalism. I guess I would call the social contract, because I think the moral foundations of capitalism are negotiated in society, and they vary enormously across societies. In some societies, it is considered moral to not give women maternity leave. Like the United States, where there is no legal, and that's a product of the social contract in that society. In some societies, it's considered moral to have workers who have no rights or no benefits and are subject to huge uncertainty in their employment lives. For me, that's the social contract, and I would argue that the combination of changes in technology, the changing role of women, the impact of climate change, and aging mean that our old social contract no longer fits modern capitalism, and that we need to renegotiate the terms around the social contract. A better social contract, and I'll be very, very brief, would be one that delivered better security, and that security would be in the form, for example, of benefit entitlements for all workers, regardless of their nature of their employment contract. I think the recent Supreme Court decision in the UK that Uber drivers are employees and that the business model of Uber is one that actually is inconsistent with what a proper employment relationship is a really interesting example of redefining the social contract around workers. I think a more secure social contract would also do a better job on pensions and social care, for example, and we can go into more detail on that. So more on security, but also much more on opportunity, much more investing in the early years, as Will mentioned, in education, in lifelong learning, in health, and so on. And so a social contract in which we invest much more in each other, partly for equality, but also because we recognize that having everyone in society being given the opportunity to use their talents and contribute is good for all of us, not just for individuals. And a better social contract needs to include a much fairer intergenerational social contract. Part of that is around climate and addressing the environmental damage that our generation and previous generation have delegated to this generation. Part of it is around dealing with debt, and part of it is around investing in young people and their education so that they can be productive in their much longer work lives. What the things I have talked about are deeply political, and that redefinition of the social contract around who gets benefits and who doesn't, what the taxation of capital and labor is relative to each other, whether the old or the young benefit from the proceeds of taxation. Those are deeply political questions and have to be resolved through our political system. And I would argue up until now, we have failed in many of these areas to redefine and to have politics that delivers better outcomes. And that's why we are where we are. The final point I want to make is on the purpose of the corporation. And so you may remember that the famous Milton Friedman essay about purpose and profit maximization basically said, firms should just maximize profits within the law. And it is not the job of corporations to worry about social consequences, the environment, the wider stakeholders. That is not the job of corporations. I mean, that's a very brutal way of saying it, but, you know, I don't want to say I'm going to get myself into trouble by saying there's some merit in the clarity of the thinking, but I worry very much about people trying to redefine the purposes of business, because there's a woolliness to it that I think is very dangerous. We have already seen the risks around ESG manifestos, voluntary compliance, and so on, because it allows people to hide what is actually going on. What I think is more powerful is to use the second part of Friedman's quote, within the law, and change the laws. I think that's a lot more powerful than changing the purpose of the corporation. So let me be more specific. Rather than have voluntary environmental standards and voluntary reporting and disclosure on ESG issues, I would make it the law. I would make it the law that all workers should get benefits in proportion to the number of hours they work, rather than having a nice cuddly discussion about, you know, you should be nice to your workers and treat them as stakeholders. I would, you know, I think we should use the powerful levers here, because these issues are way too important. You know, things like private equity. Why does, you know, at the moment, the current voluntary approach and the discussion about corporate social purpose only affects firms that are listed and that are subject to consumer pressure. So either they're pressured by investors or by consumers. That's a very small part of the business world. The vast majority of companies are not listed and don't have big global brands that are subject to boycotts and consumer movements. Private equity is a really good example. Most of those are privately held. They aren't subjected to any of those voluntary requirements. And so I'm much more in the market for pushing legal changes, which we agree as part of a new social contract embedded in institutions that enforce these requirements. I think that's a much more powerful way of reforming capitalism and reforming corporations than the current dialogue around changing purpose and being nice on ESG.
Thank you so much, Manoush. That was excellent, very clear and perfectly on time. We are running perfectly on time. Thank you both. I might give Will just a chance to respond to anything you'd like to pick up from Manoush's response there, just to also give me a chance to remind our audience that questions are open. Do both submit your own and upvote other people's questions, so we can deal with the ones you're interested in. There are a few statements in there rather than questions, but I think there's some interesting statements that we could discuss. But yeah, while the audience does that, Will, any top of mind responses to that great contribution?
A few things, and I mean, thank you first of all. I enjoyed that. I think on your, Bobby mentioned it. I co-chair the Purposeful Company, which is a little think tank which tries to promote the idea that actually purpose should drive top line growth and top line profit. That actually over time, it is the pursuit of purpose that actually delivers top line growth and actually delivers outcomes that stakeholders want. So that's the proposition. And we have a debate really about how far one can go with it before you have to get a legal intervention of the type you describe. What I would say is that I don't think you ever get a majoritarian position for legal change until you get cultural change. Think the story on smoking, banning smoking, the story on safety belts. It took, the culture had to change before governments felt it was legitimate to legislate. And I think that what's happening at the moment is, I agree with you completely on ESG investing. In fact, I said so, and I agree with you about ultimately one's going to have to say the companies need to incorporate around these principles. And your points about the rights of workers are well made, but you need to get before you get the legislation, you have to get the culture change, and in order to make the legislation stick. And I think what we're going through now is just that. On your earlier point, and I'll make this point and I'll come to my last point. Of course, I'm keenly aware, as I was writing and researching this, that there's an awful lot of economics that actually is kind of very well disposed towards the kinds of thing I'm saying tonight. And I agree with you that some of the most interesting work is being done by that. I still think, though, that the kind of standard economic model is still rooted in that, not necessarily laissez-faire or economic, but it is kind of, it's still, those roots are very, very hard to declare independence from. And I do think it still gives too much kind of intellectual cover for a kind of hyper-libertarian kind of economics, which I think is very destructive. So that's and I think that's what I wanted to say on that. And then market design. I mean 3 cheers for market design. I did again touch on that when I talked about kind of how public listing requirements and how public markets operate, and that's clearly a kind of a market design point. But I always end up kind of, I find market design kind of elusive, because what it tends to amount to, and again you can't get far with market design unless the market actors in the market that you've designed kind of respond to the incentives that and kind of internal constitutions that we create. So I would say that that market design alone, without careful consideration of the institutional structure, won't get us to Denmark. those are my 3 points.
Thank you. Thank you, Will. That's great. So we do have some excellent questions. I'm going to try and I'll kick off with ones that have been upvoted towards the top of this. I'm going to connect a couple if I can. So one from Andy Brooks. How will these new institutions be brought into being in the face of extremely powerful and wealthy vested interests that will lobby governments to resist this change? So we've got a very practical point there. But there is a connected point, I think, from Anika Abazi, who also asks, who creates these institutions and sets their moral goals? Who will guarantee the morality of these institutions? And I'd just like, be great to get reflections on both of those. A practical point of how does this work in face of vested interest, and who's actually setting the moral foundation that you talk about. Well,
I don't know whether Manoush wants to go first, because I just had a go. I mean, with it alternate with Manoush rather than me speak all the time, because I mean, I was delighted that she was
absolutely
such a firm supporter of this basic framework of which isn't that novel. I mean, there's institutional economists are beginning to become, I mean, a bit of a it's a still some of a minority sport, but it's beginning to go mainstream, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, Douglas North, sort of was the father of the field in many ways. But I think how do institutions come about? They come about through the political process. That's essentially how these institutions, whether they're institutions that say ensure that markets have fair competition, or whether they're institutions that define what employers owe their workers, they come about in the political process. And I think at the moment, I think it's very interesting how there are many social movements at play that are making the political weather around these issues. You think about climate change. Climate change is a really difficult issue for governments, but if they weren't under so much political pressure, partly to the credit of young people, but young people who then built a much broader alliance and carried many others with them around the world, there wouldn't be the pressure to act. And of course, governments aren't acting quickly enough and so on, but they would be doing even less if those big political social movements weren't putting pressure on them. So for me, I think one has to see institutions as the product of political processes in a society. And that's what determines the moral structure of our institutions. Whether we have an independent central bank that is worried about controlling inflation and preventing governments from fiscal profligacy and high inflation, which hurts the poor more than anyone else, or whether we don't have such a central bank as Turkey has and is now facing rampant inflation and currency devaluation. So those are the kind of choices that I think we face. And I think a lot of us would feel that our institutions need a little bit of updating and refreshing to face our current challenges.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I mean, you can get, you can, I mean, I think there's push and pull. I mean, I think there's, I think there's definitely kind of, pull, if you like, from the kind of political process that you described. There's also a bit of push. I mean, and that's what I was trying to say when I was reacting to your remarks. I mean, I do think that when you see a well-designed institution kind of really functioning, there is a desire to copy it or try and reproduce it. And I think that, I think British universities are strong because there is a kind of constitutional format that plainly works and has been, so there's been, it's not just the legislative framework and the political process, it's also been that, practical experience demonstrates that this is a template that would work. And I think that the one of the things that those of us who try to promote purpose in business are trying to do is say this works. If you're that actually and copy it and to make it easier for the political process to kind of happen. I mean, I think that one of the great things about leveling up is that, and I think one of the reasons why the white paper, I suspect, has been kicked into next January is two issues. One, I mean, knowing Andy Haldane as I do, and knowing actually the team at the Department of Levelling Up, I'm sure they're thinking of the institutions that can drive levelling up kind of forward, and they're unhappy with the institutional structure. I mean, education and training would be a classic one. It's not localized enough. In other words, the political structures. Another would be to pick up a great point I thought you made, and I passionately believe it, is that actually if levelling up is going to work over a decade, over a generation, there's got to be an accountability process. And actually thinking through what the accountability process is going to be and what the institution is going to be that will actually hold the levelers up to account is again kind of and making it independent or giving it some autonomy from the political process is going I mean, of course, we need to spend maybe as much as £1 trillion over a generation on really levelling up the Midlands and the north of England, Scotland and Wales. But those other things I've discussed are kind of foundational as well. So, I mean, and there is a kind of, and again, one's looking at other countries where the institutional structure kind of has worked well. I mean, Germany's business bank is 150 times bigger than our British business bank. Can we borrow and scale up that template? So it's not just, the domestic political process. There's kind of quite a lot of factors, I think, at play here. And argument and things like tonight are quite an important part of it.
So, well, just to pick up on that, so some aspect of that institutional structure, you mentioned independence there. Is that a key aspect of how you would need to set this up to get around this type of question about vested interests controlling how we actually set the terms of the debate, I guess, in the first place?
It's interesting. There are some institutions that we have, as part of our social contract and our institutional arrangements, have agreed to make independent. And I can think of two: Bank of England, which we know well. A second really good example is NICE, where it's very dangerous if politicians get to decide what the NHS pays for, because then they're just subject to different lobbying groups, and the cancer lobby, the breast cancer lobby versus the heart attack lobby versus and that would create a chaos in our healthcare system. And we've decided collectively that is too important to allow politicians to do that. And we've created an institution called NICE, which does really rigorous medical analysis of the efficacy of different medical interventions, and then cost benefit analysis, and actually has a very clear threshold of, an intervention has to deliver roughly about an additional quality adjusted life year for about £30,000 before the NHS will pay for it, roughly speaking. And we've created a very objective criteria and a group of independent experts who are making these huge life or death decisions. And they have taken the responsibility for doing that. And you know what? I think it works really well, because I think there are some aspects, some decisions where we want to shield it from the political process, but we make that decision through a political process, and then we grant autonomy to an institution to do that. And there's some very successful examples of that. The Office for Budget Responsibility, another good example of that. But I would also argue that we're in a political moment where there's a bit of a backlash against so-called technocrats and those kind of independent institutions. And there's this little bit of a pushback on trying to bring things back into politics. I spent much of my life in many of these institutions. I think they do, they often do a much better job than the political alternative, but it's not clear that that is the zeitgeist of the moment. But I think it's a very important part of the debate.
Really interesting. No, I agree. That's absolutely very current. Will, any reflections on that push and pull?
Well, I'm when I wrote The State We're In 25 years ago, I argued for an independent Bank of England, and I'm pleased with what's happened. I mean, I think that the one of the things that's happened in the last 25 years is part of it was, of course, the financial crisis 2008-9. When you think of the British financial system in 2021 compared to what it was like in the mid-90s, I mean, the rash of repossessions, that kind of, there's mis-selling going on, but I mean, I think the independent bank has been some of the Mark Carney innovations, in particular. Kind of buying commercial, been prepared to buying, commercial debt, which was prohibited up until Mark coming. The kind of the introduction of the Vickers reform, separating commercial and investment banking. The FCA and the way it regulates the financial services market. I mean, the whole thing is just, it's a much better setup than it was. It's still not. I mean, the British financial services industry has got all kinds of conflicts of interest, and there's all kinds of things going on that shouldn't be going on, particularly in the asset management industry. But the independence of the Bank of England has actually, I think, strengthened the British financial services industry and actually been good for the consumer. I mean, and I think the conduct of monetary policy has been fairly wise, and I think it's a model actually that can be deployed. So there you go, my view.
No, very good, thank you. And this is more of a statement from someone, but I think it's something that you could build on and get your reflections from. So it's on innovation and talking about Mariana Mazzucato's book, great book and analysis again, where she argues that many innovations can really be attributed to public investment. So the example given, Elon Musk would be nowhere without that investment in basic and applied research. So more of a statement, but I guess it feeds into the discussion and the thinking that both of you have developed in how these different aspects of society and economy interact. Any reflections or qualifications on that? I'm going to go to you, Will. Yeah.
Well, I'm a Mariana fan, and I wasn't as taken with the kind of Apollo kind of mission book as I was just from her earlier work actually about the entrepreneurial state. But I mean there are kind of areas of risk where the uncertainties have to be socialized or collectivized, and it has to be public initiative that undertakes that. So, I mean, that basic proposition stands. Of course, you're right that Elon Musk. I mean, if you look at what's it, Starship X, as it is called. I mean, there's an extraordinary rocket. I mean, it's 450 feet tall. It can carry 100 tons of material into space. It's recoverable, reusable. He's taken internet, he's taken 3D printing to the absolute extremes. He's lowered the costs of these rockets, not by 20, not by 30, but literally to a quarter of what NASA was actually doing. So yeah, the core technologies have been pioneered by the state, but actually it's taken Elon Musk and the fantastic resources he has he's transferring from Tesla into his company to be able to kind of make this work. It's a kind of interaction of public and private, which I wish the Americans kind of understood better. I mean, they don't really own that. I mean, they, and I wish actually Boris Johnson understood it better. I mean, I think that was, without the state, being prepared to kind of offer a sense of royalty to the vaccine manufacturers, a kind of advance a payment against actually the discovery of and then the production of the vaccine. I mean, AstraZeneca and the others would never have produced to the extent that they did. And you did need actually the digital capital, the catapults in Braintree to kind of find the land and host the facilities. It was you wanted the it wasn't just greed, as you'd said, told the House of Commons that actually, or told this Conservative Party that drove, this bewildering success story of vaccines. It was actually a very complicated interaction between the public and the private. And it, just as the American space effort is doing that. And again, that was what I was trying to capture when I talked about the economics of I and the economics of we. I mean, there is an interpenetration of these two things. You have to ride both horses. And actually, it means that it means the design institutions, and actually, if you like, the design of the markets becomes, really of co-equal importance to discretionary fiscal and monetary policy and all the other things that a lot of economists talk about.
Very good. Thank you. Manoush.
Nothing to add.
Right.
Do you agree with that? Did you agree?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's, governments that spend more on R&D have more innovative economies. Philippe Aguillon's book shows that, lots of other, lots of evidence of that. I guess I'm more in the space of supporting broad-based fundamental research with public money, and then allowing the, I think when government, there are many, many more cases of governments failing to choose the right technology than succeeding in choosing the right one. So, I guess I would be more keen on seeing broad-based R&D. The people who developed the vaccines will tell you that the reason they were able to develop those vaccines quickly was because they were building on a decade of fundamental research on vaccine development. And that is where the public funding should go. After that, whether it's AstraZeneca or Moderna or Pfizer, I think that next stage of innovation is probably best left to academics and private entrepreneurs, would be my view.
Great, thank you. So there's another question that's been highly voted up, but it's a question that's kind of directly for Will, but it'd be great to get your reflections on it too, Manoush, because it kind of broadens out very wide. So can you say more on how you achieve genuine fusion between frameworks 1 and 2, as you described them, Will, given the contradictions between them? In some ways, aren't you advocating for a new system, a framework 3, that is essentially what China has been successfully pursuing over the last 40 years, investing in health, education, and infrastructure, etc. That's an interesting question from Feng Li.
I do think that I think you could make it quite a good argument that actually Deng Xiaoping and the subsequent reformers were probably in framework 3. But actually, I would say under Xi, they're regressing like mad to framework 2, and actually not just kind of the power of the group, but actually the dictatorship of the party. I think it's a very ominous development, actually. It's a way of thinking about how China developed between 1979 and kind of 2005 that I think is quite interesting, actually, because there were dimensions of that were starting from a very low base and all the rest. But I mean, to the bigger question, I think that's, as I prepared this lecture and got to where I got to, I was hoping that question wouldn't come up, actually, because I'm aware that I need to have a better answer than the one I'm going to supply. But I think countries are path dependent. I think you start the institutional framework you have. I think that there are crises like the 2008-9 financial crisis, which leads to a recasting of the structure of the financial system. I think that I actually think that the paradox of Brexit, I think, is going to provoke a very urgent debate that is already beginning to emerge, in which the Brexiters are already aware, which is that Brexit is broken and not working, and that actually, the kind of Thatcherite fix that actually the right of the Tory party and Chancellor Sunak want to kind of address, let's have that good old time religion, let's bring some Thatcherism back. I mean, that we've drunk from that Kool-Aid, and actually the kinds of things we've been discussing this evening are, I think, I don't see how you get to raise the productivity rate to create some kind of sectors which have an inherent kind of dynamic of their own, without the kinds of policy framework I've been discussing. And I actually think that Boris Johnson's trapped in this dreadful kind of it really is a pantomime horse. The libertarian in him is kind of pointing in one direction, but as he says, the Hezzer in him, the Brexity Hezzer in him, is pointing in the other. I mean, I think he would understand quite a lot of what I've said, but his libertarians on his right, and the press that supports him, and the party loyalists who put him into the prime ministership, don't want to go in that direction. And I think in that emergent political crisis, I think these ideas have got a chance of flying. So that's my answer.
Thank you, Will. And Manoush, any reflections on that?
Well, I guess I would argue that there are 3 frameworks, but in my book, I kind of describe this in more detail, but I would define them differently, I think, than the questioner. I think there is this sort of highly individualistic model that you associated with the United States, where there's a very thin welfare state, where there's a sense that individuals have to carry the risks that they face in society, and they're sort of on their own. I think in many Asian countries, there is much greater emphasis on the collective and the collective interests over those of the individuals, and where collective interests are where there's a trade-off between the interests of the individual and the collective, there's a tendency to say, we look out for the collective first. I think the third framework is a little bit what many European countries are trying to do, which is to get the balance between individual liberty and the interests of the collective, and to be able to try and reconcile the two of those. So having individual freedom, having democracy, having human rights, but at the same time, recognizing that there are some risks that are best shared among us, and where we suppress our collective, we suppress our individual desires for the interests of the public good. And I think that third framework is one that actually is quite appealing. But I think part of the dilemma we're in is that getting that balance right between the rights of the individual and the rights of the collective are tricky. And I think COVID in many ways was a great test. In the US, nobody wants to wear a mask. In Asia, everyone happily wears a mask. And in Europe, it's a bit of a muddle. but it's a good example of these tensions between individual freedom and collective interests.
I think COVID is, we haven't discussed it much this evening, but I am a supporter of certainly mandatory vaccination for people who work in care homes and in the NHS, and I think that's I think it. And I'm tempted to go beyond that, actually, to say that if you go to a football match or a club or a restaurant, you should also show at the entrance that you've been vaccinated and you've got your booster jab. And it's quite, and I wonder whether one of the lessons of COVID is going to be that the we-ness, if you like, is going to triumph over the libertarian I-ness, where where it's so obvious that actually the anti-vaxxers are actually endangering not just their own health, but the health of all of us.
Yeah, yes, it's good to get that. COVID obviously being incredibly relevant to this. We've got like 2 minutes left.
All right.
I wanted to just quickly get your very final reflections from the two of you. We did have a question about the current morality of capitalism describes our internal moral compass, or our spiritual capital, where corporate employees are cutthroat by day and volunteer at the weekends. What would change if we could leverage our individual collective spiritual capital? And I guess that's just a 30-second answer, maybe starting with Manoush to get you to round up, Will. Just on the positive vision, I guess, for the future, if we can bring these elements together. Manoush.
Well, I think we need to measure economic success in many different ways. GDP is a very small part of the story. People's well-being, their life expectancy, their health, the quality of the relationships they have and the community in which they live are all measures of success. And I think if we broadened our measures of success, we would have a much easier time of reconciling our individual and collective interests.
That's great. Thank you so much. Will.
Well, I'm always, I'm paraphrasing, but I always quote the Aristotelian kind of question, what makes man or woman happy? Is it material well-being? Is it the quality of their friendships, their family life, and the clothing on their back, the home, and roof over their head? No. I think what makes people happy is actually having a purpose, using the gifts that gods and nature have given them to make the world incrementally better. And actually I don't think that I think that the third framework that I tried to outline tonight, I hope we give more of that possibility.
Brilliant. Thank you. What a great positive way to round off. Just 1 minute past 6. So we're drawing to a close, more or less, pretty much on time. So before my final thanks, I just want to flag that the video recording will be available on the website in the next couple of days. And you may also want to watch the recording of the Levelling Up event that we mentioned earlier, again on our new revamped website. Do visit the campaign hubs, where you'll find lots of interesting material on COVID and levelling up from the social sciences. And watch out for more topics next year. And also the details on the website, how people can support the campaign and get involved. Please do have a look. We're always interested in active involvement from our whole community. So finally, just leaves it for me to say thanks to all of you for coming. Thanks to Sage Publishing for supporting the event, again, hugely valued. And to the team at Sage and the Campaign for Social Science for putting this together, particularly Steve Gundry. To Katie for her contribution at the beginning, and of course Manoush for brilliant contribution throughout. And finally, to Will Hutton, our President of the Academy. Thank you, Will. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you all. Hopefully see you in person.
Thanks, Bob. Thank you, Bobby, for chairing so well.
No problem. See you in person in 2022.